The wind in the Arizona territory did not merely blow, it scoured. It carried the taste of copper dust and dried sage, grinding against the wooden siding of the cabin as if trying to sand it down to nothing. It was late afternoon in the autumn of 1879, and the sun hung low and angry over the red rocks, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley floor. Abigail Mercer stood on the porch of the small, weathering shack that she called home, wiping her hands on a faded apron. At 21 years of age, Abby possessed a beauty that the harsh country had not yet managed to erode, though it certainly tried its hardest. Her hair was the color of wheat just before harvest, pulled back severely to keep it out of her eyes while she worked, but loose strands always fought their way free. Her hands were rough, stained green from crushing creosote leaves and brown from garden soil. She looked toward the east, where the dust hung suspended in the air like a curtain. The stagecoach road ran about a quarter of a mile from their front door. It was the lifeline of the territory, connecting the booming mining towns to the rest of civilization. But for the Mercer family, it was merely a reminder of everything they could not afford and everywhere they could not go. "Abby," a voice called from inside the cabin. It was thin and reedy, like dry grass rustling. Abby turned and stepped back into the dim interior. "I'm here, Mama." Ruth Mercer sat in a rocking chair near the cold hearth, a quilt pulled up to her waist despite the lingering heat of the day. She was a woman who had faded. Since the death of Abby's father 3 years ago, Ruth had become translucent, as if her spirit were slowly leaking out into the dry air. "Is Eli back yet?" Ruth asked, her eyes darting toward the window. "It is getting late. The shadows are stretching." "He will be back soon," Abby said, her voice steady and soothing, a tone she had perfected over years of managing calamity. "He only went to check the snares near the dry creek bed. You know how he is. He loses track of time." Abby moved to the table to sort the herbs she had gathered earlier. She separated the globe mallow from the sage, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. This was how they survived. The town of Granite Peak, 5 miles to the west, had a doctor oblivious to the needs of the poor, and certainly unwilling to treat the family of Jacob Mercer. So, Abby had become the healer she needed to be. She stitched cuts, set broken fingers, and brewed teas for fevers. She had learned some from her mother before Ruth's mind grew foggy, and the rest she had learned from the brutal necessity of keeping herself and her brother alive. But the town did not call her a healer. They called her the trader's daughter. The memory of her father was a bitter pill that never dissolved. Jacob Mercer had been a man of big dreams and bad luck, eventually accused of moving stolen goods for a ring of speculators. He had died in a chaotic gunfight behind a saloon, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a stain on his name that no amount of scrubbing could remove. To the righteous folks of Granite Peak, the Mercers were trash, complicit in the lawlessness that plagued the territory. Abby tied a bundle of dried mint with a piece of twine. She did not have the luxury of grieving her father's death, only the burden of surviving his reputation. 5 miles away, in the deceptive shade of a sandstone overhang, a man lay perfectly still. He blended so seamlessly with the stone and scrub brush that a passerby could have walked within 3 feet of him and never knew he was there. He was Apache. The white men called him Hawk. He was alone, which was dangerous, and he was bleeding, which was worse. A jagged tear ran along his left side, just above the hip. It was not a bullet wound, but the result of a fall down a shale slope 2 days prior when he had been evading a cavalry patrol. The rock had sliced him deep. He had packed the wound with mud and moss, but the heat of the infection was beginning to radiate through his body, a dull throb that matched the beating of his heart. Hawk opened his eyes. They were dark, assessing, and devoid of fear. Fear was a waste of energy, and he had no energy left to spare. He shifted slightly, testing his limb. The pain was sharp, but his leg still held his weight. He was separated from his band, cut off by the sudden movement of blue-coated soldiers who seemed to be swarming the territory like ants on a carcass. He reached for his canteen. It was light. Perhaps 2 mouthfuls of water remained. He looked out over the vast, broken landscape. To the white man, this land was a hell of heat and hostility. To Hawk, it was a chessboard. He knew where the water pockets were hidden in the rocks. He knew that the sudden silence of the cicadas meant a predator was moving nearby. He knew that the dust cloud on the horizon meant a stagecoach was churning up the road. He watched that dust cloud now. His people were being blamed for every misfortune that befell the invaders. If a horse went lame, it was an Apache curse. If a cow wandered off, an Apache stole it. And lately, the stagecoaches were being hit. Men with rifles and masked faces were stopping the heavy wagons, taking gold and payroll boxes, and leaving bodies in the dirt. The newspapers in the capital screamed that it was renegade war parties. Hawk knew better. He had seen the tracks of the men who raided the wagons. They wore boots with heels, and their horses were shod with iron. But truth was of little consequence to the men who wrote the laws. He took one small sip of water, holding it in his mouth to wet his tongue before swallowing. He needed to move. To stay still was to die. He had to cross the valley floor under the cover of the coming night to reach the higher peaks where his brothers might be waiting. He checked his knife. The blade was clean and sharp. It was the only absolute truth he possessed. The door to the Mercer cabin banged open, startling Ruth in her chair. Abby spun around, a reprimand on her lips, but it died the moment she saw her brother. Eli stood in the doorway, his chest heaving. He was 11 years old, with the same blonde hair as his sister, though he was chopped short and perpetually dusty. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and a dark, angry bruise was already blooming on his cheekbone. "Eli?" Abby dropped the herbs and rushed to him. She fell to her knees, grabbing his shoulders, her eyes scanning him for worse injuries. "What happened? Did you fall?" Eli pulled away, his face twisted in a mixture of shame and fury. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, smearing dirt and a little blood across his upper lip. "I didn't fall," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Then what?" Abby demanded, though a cold knot in her stomach told her she already knew the answer. "It was the Miller boys." Eli spat the words out. "And two others I didn't know. By the water trough, at the edge of town." "I told you not to go near town." "Eli," Abby said, her voice rising in frustration. "I told you to stay near the creek bed." "I needed a new whetstone," Eli shouted back, tears finally spilling over his dirty lashes. "Mine broke. I just wanted to trade rabbit skin for it. I didn't say anything to them." Abby softened. She reached out and gently touched the bruise on his face. "What did they do?" "They boxed me in," Eli said, looking at the floor. "Throwing rocks, calling me names. They said Papa was a thief. They said—" He swallowed hard. "They said the only good Mercer is a dead one, just like the only good Indian." Abby felt a flash of white-hot anger sing her insides. It was the same anger she swallowed every time she walked into the general store and saw the prices change the moment she approached the counter. It was the same anger she felt when the Reverend looked through her as if she were made of glass. "Come here," she said quietly. She pulled Eli into a hug. He was stiff at first, trying to be the man of the house, but then he melted against her, sobbing quietly into her shoulder. "They are wrong. Eli, you hear me? They are wrong." Ruth spoke up from her chair, her voice trembling. "They will never let us be. Abby, we should leave. We should go west, to California." "With what money, Mama?" Abby asked, looking over Eli's shoulder at their mother. "We have $12 in the tin. That wouldn't get us across the river, let alone to the ocean." She pulled back and looked Eli in the eye. "Distinct. Go wash your face in the basin. I will put a poultice on that bruise. It will help with the swelling." As Eli moved away, sniffing, Abby stood up and walked to the window. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was turning a deep, violent purple. The temperature was dropping rapidly. That was the way of this country. It burned you by day and froze you by night. She watched the empty road. The isolation was terrifying, but tonight she was almost grateful for it. She wanted a wall between her family and the town. She wanted to build a fortress where the Miller boys and the hypocritical shopkeepers could not reach them. But she knew that was a fantasy. They depended on the town for flour, for ammunition, for the few supplies they could not make themselves. And the town depended on having someone to look down upon. I hate them, Eli whispered from the wash basin. Do not say that, Abby said automatically, though her heart agreed with him. Hate is a poison, Eli. It hurts the vessel that holds it more than the thing it is poured on. It is not poison if it is true, the boy countered. Abby sighed. She walked over to him and began to mix a paste of arnica and water. Sit still. As she applied the cool paste to his cheek, she saw the hardness in his eyes. It was a look that belonged to a grown man, not a child. He was being forged by this hatred, hammered into something sharp and brittle. She had to protect him, not just his body, but his soul. If he grew up believing he was trash, he would become trash. We are going to be fine, she told him. She made sure her voice did not waver. We have each other, we have the house, and I have a new batch of salve to sell next week. I heard the blacksmith has a burn on his arm. He will pay for my medicine, regardless of my name. Night fell completely. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the logs. In his rocky shelter, Hawk shivered. The infection was making him cold, a deep chill that settled in his bones. He wrapped his blanket tighter around his shoulders. It was a wool blanket, stolen from a cavalry supply wagon months ago. He watched the lights of the mining town flickering in the distance, miles away. They looked like fallen stars, cold and indifferent. He heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road below. He tensed, his hand going to his knife. He peered over the edge of the rock. A group of 5 riders moved along the road, heading away from town. They did not ride like soldiers. Soldiers rode in formation. These men rode loose, slouching in their saddles. They were laughing. The sound carried on the wind. Hawk narrowed his eyes. He saw the glint of a bottle being passed around. He saw the long coats. These were the men who made the tracks he had seen. The predators. They were heading toward the Badlands, toward the canyons where the shadows were deepest. Hawk knew he should not care. Whatever these men did to their own kind was none of his concern, but he felt a prickle of unease. The spirits of the land were restless tonight. He closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe slowly, willing his heart rate to drop. He needed to sleep. Tomorrow, he will have to move. If he stayed here another day, the fever would take his legs, and then the buzzards would take the rest. Back in the cabin, the fire had burned down to embers. Ruth had gone to bed behind the curtain that separated the sleeping area from the main room. Eli was asleep on his pallet near the hearth, the firelight casting dancing shadows on his face. Abby sat at the table, a single candle burning in front of her. She was mending Eli's torn shirt. Every stitch was an act of defiance. You tear us, we mend ourselves. You break us, we heal. She thought about the ledger at the general store. Mr. Henderson, the owner, always added a few cents here and there to her bill. Interest, he called it. Theft, she called it. But she could say nothing. If she argued, he would cut off their credit, and they would starve come winter. Yesterday, a woman in town had pulled her skirts aside when Abby walked past. As if Abby carried a contagious disease, it was humiliating. It made her want to scream, but she didn't scream. She swallowed it. She swallowed it all for Eli. She looked over at the sleeping boy. He twitched in his sleep, fighting dream battles. I will get us out of here, she whispered to the empty room. I swear it. She didn't know how. She didn't know when, but she knew she could not let Eli grow into a man in a place that wanted to see him hanged for the sins of a father he barely remembered. A gust of wind slammed against the door, rattling the heavy iron latch. Abby paused, her needle hovering over the fabric. For a second, she thought she heard something else, a cry or a call, carried on the wind. She held her breath, listening. Nothing but the howling gale. She shook her head. Her nerves were frayed. It was just the storm brewing. The air felt heavy, charged with static. A real storm was coming. One of those desert monsoons that could turn dry washes into raging rivers in a matter of minutes. She finished the last stitch and bit the thread. She folded the shirt and placed it on the chair. She walked to the door and checked the bolt. It was solid. She checked the shutters. They were fastened. She was the guardian of this small, fragile fortress. Abby blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. She lay down on her own cot, listening to the rhythm of Eli's breathing and the wheezing of her mother from behind the curtain. Outside, the Arizona night was vast and indifferent. It held the Apache warrior bleeding in the rocks. And it held the young woman praying in the dark. It held the predators riding on the road. And it held the town sleeping in its prejudice. They were all specks of dust in a whirlwind, unaware that their paths were already spiraling toward one another. Abby closed her eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. She kept seeing the bruise on Eli's face. "Safe?" she murmured into her pillow. "Just keep him safe." That was the only prayer she had left. The storm did not arrive with a polite knock. It kicked the door down. What had begun as a low moan in the canyon throats shifted, within the span of 20 minutes, into a shrieking banshee of dust and grit. The sky, previously a bruised purple, turned a sickly, opaque ochre. The wind tore across the open range, ripping up sagebrush by the roots and sending tumbleweeds hurtling through the air like cannonballs. Abby was in the small barn, wrestling with the latch on the goat pen. When the first true gust hit, it shook the timber frame of the structure so violently that dust rained down from the rafters. "Eli?" She screamed, her voice snatched away the moment it left her throat. She pushed out of the barn, shielding her eyes with her forearm. The world had vanished. The familiar landmarks, the twisted ironwood tree, the distant ridge of the Superstition Mountains were gone, swallowed by a wall of brown fury. Through the haze, she saw the silhouette of the calf. It was the young brindle one, the most skittish of their meager herd. It had broken through the split-rail fence, panicked by the sudden drop in pressure. "No!" Abby yelled. She saw a smaller figure darting after it. Eli. He was leaning into the wind, a rope coiled in his hand, chasing the calf toward the stagecoach road. The boy was foolishly brave, terrified that losing a calf meant losing dinner for a month. "Eli, let it go!" Abby shrieked, lungs burning with the intake of sand. He could not hear her. He was 50 yards away and gaining speed. The calf veered erratically, heading straight for the depression of the road where the wind funneled with dangerous velocity. Abby began to run. Her skirts tangled around her legs, heavy and cumbersome. She fought against the gale, every step a battle. The dust was abrasive, scouring her exposed skin like sandpaper. Then, the sound changed. Above the howl of the wind, a thunderclap shattered the air, loud enough to rattle her teeth. It was not just wind anymore. The heavens opened up. The rain did not fall in drops. It fell in sheets, a deluge of cold, heavy water that turned the airborne dust into instant, blinding mud. Lightning forked down, hitting the ridgeline, illuminating the chaos in a strobe light flash. In that brief second of white light, Abby saw them. Eli had reached the road. The calf was gone, bolted into the brush. But Eli was not alone. 3 riders were there, struggling with their mounts in the sudden deluge. Their horses were rearing, eyes rolling white in terror. One of the riders, a large man in a long duster coat, swung his horse around. The animal's shoulder clipped Eli. The boy spun and fell hard into the mud. "Eli!" Darkness slammed back down. Abby scrambled forward, slipping on the slick clay. She fell to her hands and knees, scrambling back up, ignoring the sting of gravel in her palms. When the next flash of lightning came, the road was empty. The riders were gone. Eli was gone. "Eli!" She reached the spot where he had fallen. The mud was churned up, a chaotic mess of hoof prints and boot marks. She saw the distinct drag marks, 2 furrows in the earth where feet had been pulled. They led away from the house, away from the road, veering sharply toward the jagged limestone formations of the Skull Basin. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the adrenaline. They had taken him, or he had grabbed a stirrup and been dragged, or he was chasing them. It did not matter. He was gone, and the storm was erasing his trail with every second that passed. Abby did not think. She did not return to the cabin to tell Ruth. She did not go back for a weapon. She simply turned and followed the drag marks, plunging into the teeth of the storm. The trek into the basin was a nightmare. The rain was freezing, soaking her dress until it weighed 20 pounds. Clinging to her legs like iron chains, the wind pushed her toward the rocks, trying to smash her against the canyon walls. She fell twice. The first time, she scraped her shin raw. The second time, she hit her head against a low-hanging branch, seeing stars that had nothing to do with the storm. But she got up. The image of Eli, small and bruised, drove her forward with a strength she did not know she possessed. The drag marks were fading, washing away into the rivulets of muddy water coursing down the slope. She had to guess the direction. The Skull Basin was a labyrinth of slot canyons and box draws, a place where outlaws and drifters often camped to avoid the law. After what felt like an hour, the rain began to lessen, transitioning from a deluge to a steady, rhythmic drumming. The wind died down, leaving behind a heavy, electric silence broken only by the sound of rushing water in the washes. She rounded a bend in the canyon, gasping for breath, her chest heaving. Ahead, tucked into a deep overhang of the cliff face, she saw the glow. Firelight. It flickered orange and warm against the wet stone. As she drew closer, squinting through the wet strands of hair plastered to her face, she made out the shapes of tents. They were heavy canvas, rigged tightly against the wind. It looked like a camp. A trader's camp, perhaps, or a group of cattlemen waiting out the weather. Relief washed over her, so profound it almost made her knees buckle. Men, civilized men. They would help her. They might even have seen the riders. Maybe Eli was there, warming himself by the fire. She did not pause to consider caution. Fear for her brother had stripped away her natural wariness. She scrambled up the scree slope, her boots sliding on the wet rocks. "Hello," she croaked, but her voice was hoarse. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Help, please." There was no answer. The camp seemed quiet, though the fire was banked high. She reached the perimeter. There were 3 tents. A horse was picketed near the back, stamping its feet in the mud. She did not look closely at the horse. She ran toward the largest tent, the one where the flap was slightly ajar, revealing a warm, golden interior light. "Please, I need help." Abby threw back the canvas flap and burst inside, bringing the smell of rain and ozone with her. "My brother, he is—" The words died in her throat. She had expected a fat trader with a pipe, or a cowboy cleaning his gun. She had expected safety. Instead, she stepped into the den of a wolf. The interior of the tent was sparse. A single lantern sat on a crate, casting long, sharp shadows. In the center of the space, a man stood half-turned toward the entrance. He was not a white man. He was tall, lean, and composed entirely of wire and whipcord muscle. His skin was the color of bronze that had been left in the fire too long. He wore breeches of buckskin, darkened with grease and wear, but his chest was bare, and he was covered in blood. Abby froze. Her breath hitched in a painful gasp. The man froze too. It was the Apache. He stood with a stillness that was unnatural, like a statue carved from mahogany. In his right hand, he held a knife, a terrifying thing with a blade as long as her forearm, glinting in the lantern light. In his left hand, he held a bloody rag pressed against his side. They stared at each other. 2 animals caught in the same snare. Abby's mind raced, trying to process the image. This was the enemy. This was the monster the town whispered about, the savage who stole children and burned ranches. This was the face of the fear that gripped the territory. And yet, in that suspended second, she saw something else. She saw the sweat beating on his forehead. She saw the tremor in the hand that held the rag. She saw the fresh, angry wound on his hip, a gash that had been bleeding freely until he pressed the cloth to it. He wasn't attacking. He was mending. He had been in the middle of cutting away necrotic flesh or digging for a bullet. "You," she whispered, the syllable trembling. Hawk did not speak. His eyes, black as obsidian, locked onto hers. He did not raise the knife in a threat, but he did not lower it either. He assessed her soaked dress, her wild hair, the terror radiating off her like heat waves. He saw that she was unarmed. He saw that she was alone. Abby backed up a step, her hand fumbling for the tent flap behind her. I made a mistake. I am sorry. She turned to flee. Suddenly, Hawk moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast for her eyes to track. He dropped the rag, ignoring the fresh welling of blood at his hip, and lunged across the small space. Abby opened her mouth to scream. His hand clamped over her mouth hard, calloused, smelling of copper and wet leather. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pinning her arms to her sides. He slammed her back against his chest, pulling her away from the entrance, dragging her into the deep shadows at the rear of the tent. She struggled, kicking out, panic exploding in her brain. He is going to kill me. He is going to slit my throat. Shh, he hissed. The sound was a command, sharp and guttural. He did not squeeze her throat. He did not bring the knife down. He held her immobile, his body rigid against hers. Listen, he whispered, his mouth right next to her ear. His English was heavily accented, the words rough like gravel. Abby stopped struggling, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She listened. Outside, over the sound of the rain, she heard it. Voices. "Check the draw," a man shouted. The voice was gruff, American. "I saw smoke. Someone is down there. Probably just a squatter," another voice replied. "Or maybe that redskin we winged 2 days back. If it is him, I want the scalp. The bounty is $20. The sound of hooves squelched in the mud. Close, very close. They were right outside the tent. Abby went cold. The Miller gang, the men who took Eli, or another group entirely. It did not matter. They were men hunting for blood, and they were 20 feet away. She felt the tension in the man holding her. Hawk was not holding her hostage. He was hiding her. If those men came in and found a white woman in the arms of an Apache warrior, they would not ask questions. They would kill him, and God only knew what they would do to her before they killed her too. Slowly, agonizingly, Hawk loosened his hand over her mouth just a fraction, testing her. Abby drew in a shaky breath through her nose. She nodded, a tiny movement against his palm. "I understand." He removed his hand but kept his arm around her waist, keeping her pressed into the darkest corner of the tent, behind a stack of crates. He positioned himself slightly in front of her, shielding her body with his own. The flap of the tent rippled as the wind caught it. "Anyone in there?" a voice called out. Abby felt Hawk's muscles coil. He shifted his grip on the knife. He was ready for spring. He was wounded, bleeding, and outnumbered, but the lethality radiating from him was palpable. He would take 2 or 3 of them with him before he went down. Abby looked at his side. The blood was running darker now, sliding down his ribs, soaking into the waistband of his breeches. He was hurt badly. He should be faint. Yet he stood like a drawn bowstring. "Hello, the camp," the voice yelled again. A shadow fell across the canvas entrance. A man was standing right there. Abby's heart stopped. If the man opened the flap, it was over. Then, a crack of thunder shook the ground, followed instantly by a shout from further down the canyon. "Hey, over here, fresh tracks." The shadow at the door hesitated. "Tracks," the man muttered. "Looks like a mule and a walker heading toward the north ridge." The shadow moved away. "Coming!" The sound of heavy boots retreating through the mud followed. "Let's go. Boys, don't let them get to the high ground." The hoofbeats receded, fading into the noise of the storm. Inside the tent, the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The Hawk did not move for a long time. He waited until the vibrations of the horses had completely vanished from the earth. Only then did his grip on Abby loosen. He stepped back, swaying slightly. The adrenaline that had propped him up was fading, leaving the pain to rush back in. He hissed through his teeth, his hand going immediately to his hip. Abby turned to face him. She should run. The men were gone. She could run back into the dark and find her way home. This man was an Apache. He was dangerous. But she looked at him. Really looked at him. He was young, perhaps only a few years older than she was. His face was sharp-angled, handsome in a severe, terrifying way, and he was in agony. The blood was pooling at his feet. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain but still fiercely intelligent. He waited for her to scream, to run, to accuse him. He had just saved her life, or at least her virtue, by hiding her. He could have thrown her out to them as a distraction. He could have killed her to keep her silent. He had done neither. "Your brother," he rasped, the English words difficult for him. He gestured vaguely toward the door with his chin. "Not with them." Abby blinked, stunned that he had remembered her frantic plea. "No, I thought they had him." She looked at the wound on his hip. It was ugly. The edges were jagged and angry red. If he did not close it and clean it properly, the fever would take him within 2 days. "You are bleeding," she said. It was a stupid observation, but it was the only thing her mind could latch on to. "Go," Hawk said. He turned away from her, stumbling slightly toward the crate where his supplies lay. He picked up the rag, his hands shaking uncontrollably now. "Go, white girl, go!" He was dismissing her. He was giving her a chance to leave before he collapsed, or before he changed his mind. Abby took a step toward the flap. The wind outside howled, cold and wet. She thought of Eli. He was out there somewhere, alone. She looked back at Hawk. He had sunk down onto a pile of furs. His head bowed, trying to wrap the bandage around his own waist, but his fingers were slick with blood and fumbling. He let out a low, frustrated growl. He was a warrior, a killer, perhaps. But at this moment, he was just a man trying to stitch himself together so he could survive the night. Abby thought of the Bible verse her mother used to read. The Good Samaritan. But there were no Samaritans in Arizona. There were only survivors. She looked at his hands. They were strong, but failing. She made a decision. It was a decision that would likely get her shunned, or killed, or worse. But Abigail Mercer had never been good at doing what the town expected of her. She let the tent flap fall closed. She turned back to him. "You cannot tie that with one hand," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. Hawk looked up, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Abby took a step closer, raising her hands to show she held no weapon. "I am a healer, of sorts. I can help." Hawk watched her. He did not speak. He did not nod. But he did not tell her to go again. He simply watched her with that intense, unnerving gaze, assessing the truth in her soul. Abby knelt beside him. The smell of him rain, sage, blood, and man filled her senses. It was a scent that was entirely alien to her world of soap and sawdust. Yet, strangely, it did not smell like fear. "Let me see," she whispered. Hawk hesitated for a heartbeat. Then, slowly, he moved his hand away from the wound. Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them into this small, fragile bubble of light. Abby reached out, her pale fingers hovering over his dark skin. This was a mistake. This was the wrong tent. But as she touched the hot skin near the wound, and he flinched but did not pull away, Abby knew with a sudden, terrifying clarity that there was nowhere else on earth she was meant to be. The rain had turned the world into a blurring, gray wash of water and stone. The wind did not howl anymore. It hissed, cutting through the canyons with a wet, heavy malice. Hawk moved with a fluidity that defied the jagged tear in his side. He did not walk so much as flow over the wet rocks, his moccasins finding purchase on slick shale where Abby's boots struggled to hold. He kept to the shadows, hugging the base of the cliff walls, his dark eyes scanning the deluge for threats that might emerge from the gloom. Abby followed him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her skirts were heavy with mud, weighing her down like lead anchors. But she did not complain. She could not complain. Every time she looked at the back of the Apache warrior, she saw the dark stain of blood slowly expanding on the fabric at his waist. He was moving for her. He was moving for Eli. They had left the tent 10 minutes ago, slipping out the back way just as the voices of the riders had faded toward the north ridge. Hawk had not spoken a word. He had simply jerked his chin toward a narrow fissure in the rock face, a deer trail that wound upward and away from the main wash. Now, they were high above the valley floor, navigating a labyrinth of sandstone pillars. Hawk stopped suddenly, raising a hand. Abby froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She crouched low, mimicking his posture. Hawk knelt in the mud, examining something at the edge of a puddle. He motioned for her to come closer. Abby crept forward, squinting through the rain. There, snagged on the thorns of a mesquite bush, was a scrap of fabric. It was red flannel, checkered and faded. "Eli," Abby whispered, the sound torn from her throat. She reached out and plucked the fabric from the thorns. It was wet and cold, but she pressed it to her cheek as if it were a living thing. "This is his shirt. He was wearing this." Hawk looked at the fabric, then at the ground. He traced a shape in the mud with his finger. It was a boot print, deep and heavy. "Men with iron on their heels," Hawk said, his voice low and rough. "Not Apache. They drag him." Abby looked at the print. It was a chaotic smear, but she could see the distinct outline of a heel. "They have him still." "They keep him," Hawk said. He looked toward the east, where the canyon narrowed into a box canyon known as Dead Man's Drop. "Bait." "Bait," Abby repeated, the blood draining from her face. "For whom?" "For you," Hawk said, his gaze shifting to her. "Or for anyone who cares. They want to draw out the family, or they want to blame the—" He tapped his own chest. "The people." Abby understood then. The rumors in town, the anger, the sudden rise in attacks. It was not a coincidence. These men were staging scenes. They had taken Eli not just to be cruel, but to create a narrative. If Eli was found dead, or if the Mercer family was wiped out, the town would scream for Apache blood. "We have to get him," Abby said, her voice hardening. She shoved the scrap of fabric into her pocket. "How far?" "Close," Hawk said. He started to rise, but as he put weight on his left leg, his knee buckled. He caught himself on the rock wall, a sharp hiss of breath escaping his teeth. His face, already pale beneath the bronze of his skin, went gray. The bandage Abby had hastily applied in the tent had soaked through. "Stop," Abby said. She moved to his side, grabbing his arm to support him. His skin was burning hot, radiating a fever that the cold rain could not douse. "No, stop," Hawk gritted out, trying to pull away. "Boy is close. You will bleed to death before we get there," Abby said firmly. She did not let go. "And then who will help me fight them? I cannot do this alone. Hawk, I need you standing." It was the first time she had used his name. The word hung in the air between them, stripping away the anonymity of their alliance. He looked at her, surprised by the authority in her tone. She was small, soaked, and trembling with cold, but her eyes were steady. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head. "There." He pointed to a shallow overhang a few yards away, protected from the rain by a shelf of rock. They moved into the shelter. It was dry and smelled of dust and old animal droppings, but it was out of the wind. Hawk sank down against the stone wall, his breathing shallow and rapid. Abby wasted no time. She knelt beside him and opened the small leather satchel she had tied to her waist, her gathering bag. She did not have her full medical kit, but she had the essentials. She always carried a small knife, a spool of heavy thread she used for binding herbs, and a needle stuck into the leather flap. "I need to see it," she said. Hawk pulled the blood-soaked rag away. The wound was ugly. The exertion of the climb had torn the edges of the gash further apart. It was deep, slicing through the muscle but missing the organs. Abby took a deep breath. She reached into her bag and pulled out a handful of sage leaves she had gathered earlier that day. She crushed them in her hand, mixing them with a little rainwater she caught from the drip line of the overhang. "This will sting," she warned. Hawk did not reply. He stared at the opposite wall, his jaw set like granite. Abby pressed the poultice into the wound. Hawk's abdominal muscles spasmed violently, and a low groan vibrated in his chest. But he did not cry out. He did not grab her hand to stop her. "I have to close it," Abby said, threading the needle with steady fingers. "If I do not, you will leave a trail of blood for them to follow." She looked up at him. "Do you trust me?" Hawk turned his head slowly. He looked at her hands stained with mud and his own blood, yet moving with the precision of a spider spinning a web. He had seen white women before, usually from a distance. They were often portrayed as fragile things, fainting at the sight of violence. But this woman was different. She looked at the torn flesh of his hip not with disgust, but with a mechanic's eye. "So," he said. Abby began. She did not have whiskey to numb the pain, nor laudanum to dull his senses. She simply drove the needle through the tough skin, pulling the edges of the wound together. Hawk watched her. He watched the way she bit her lip in concentration. He watched the way she did not flinch when fresh blood welled up over her fingers. She worked quickly, her movements economical and practiced. She was a healer, yes, but she possessed the stomach of a warrior. In his culture, the women fought when the camp was attacked. They were strong. He saw that same strength in the set of Abby's jaw. She was not a burden he was carrying. She was a partner. "Done," she whispered after what felt like an eternity. She tied off the knot and cut the thread with her knife. "It is not pretty, but it will hold." She sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron. She was shaking now, the adrenaline dipping just enough to let the cold in. Hawk reached out. His hand, large and warm, covered hers. It was a brief, tentative contact. "Good hands," he said. "Strong hands." Abby looked down at his hand covering hers. The contrast was stark, his dark skin against her pale, blood-streaked knuckles. For a moment, the war outside, the missing brother, the hatred of the town, all of it faded. There was just the gratitude of a man who had been put back together. "We have to go," she said, her voice soft. "Eli is waiting." Hawk withdrew his hand. He pushed himself up, testing the leg. The pain was still there, a dull roar, but the tearing sensation was gone. The stitches held. "Yes," he said. "We hunt." They found the ravine 20 minutes later. It was a narrow cut in the earth, shaped like a funnel. At the bottom, where the water pooled in a muddy slurry, sat Eli. He was huddled under a dead ironwood tree, his knees pulled up to his chest. He was soaked through, shivering so hard his teeth chattered audibly even from a distance. His hands were bound behind his back, tied to the trunk of the tree. 30 feet away, on a higher ledge protected by a tarp, sat 2 men. They had a small fire going, struggling against the damp. A bottle of whiskey sat between them. "Stop crying, boy," one of the men growled. Abby recognized the voice. It was a drifter named Stark who had passed through town a week ago looking for work. "Your sister will come soon enough, or your mama. Then we can have some real fun." Abby felt a surge of rage so pure it nearly blinded her. She started to move forward, but Hawk's hand clamped onto her shoulder. "Wait," he whispered. "2 guns. 1 you." "I do not have a gun," Abby hissed. "Exactly," Hawk said. He scanned the terrain. "I draw them. You take a boy. Go up the wash. Do not look back." "What about you?" "I am Apache," he said, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was a terrifying, grim expression. "They fear me. I will give them reason." He slipped away into the darkness before she could argue. Abby waited, her heart counting the seconds. She watched the men by the fire. One of them stood up to relieve himself against a rock. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the canyon. It was not a human shout. It was the scream of a mountain lion, a high, piercing shriek that made the hair on Abby's arms stand up. It came from the ridge directly opposite the men. The horses, tethered nearby, went wild. They reared and pulled at their ropes, screaming in panic. "Cougar!" Stark yelled, grabbing his rifle. "Damn it! Hold the horses!" The second man scrambled up, knocking over the whiskey bottle. "It sounded big! It is right on top of us!" Another sound came, the distinct snap of a heavy branch breaking, followed by the clatter of falling rocks. Further down the canyon, away from Eli, "It is circling," Stark shouted. "Get the light, go look." Both men moved away from the boy, their rifles trained on the dark ridge, moving toward the sound of the disturbance. Abby moved. She slid down the mud bank, ignoring the scrape of stones against her legs. She hit the bottom of the ravine and splashed through the ankle-deep water. "Eli," she whispered. The boy looked up, his eyes wide and terrified. "Abby, hush," she commanded. She reached him and spun him around. The knots were wet and tight. She fumbled for her knife, sawing frantically at the rope. "Do not speak. We are leaving. There are men," Eli whimpered. "They hit me." "I know," Abby said, her voice shaking with suppressed violence. "They will not hit you again." The rope snapped. Eli fell forward into her arms. She hauled him up. He was heavy, dead weight with exhaustion. But she pulled him. "Run," she whispered. "Up the wash. Low." They scrambled up the opposite side of the ravine, away from the men and away from where Hawk had gone. As they crested the lip of the canyon, Abby looked back. She saw a shadow move near the fire. It was not a mountain lion. It was a man. He moved silently, stepping into the light just long enough to cut the picket ropes of the bandits' horses. He slapped the rump of the nearest beast. The horses bolted, thundering down the canyon, disappearing into the night. "My horse," Stark screamed from the darkness. "Someone cut the line! It is the Apache!" the other man yelled, firing his rifle blindly into the dark. The gunshot echoed like a cannon blast, rolling thunder through the wet rocks. Abby did not wait to see more. She grabbed Eli's hand and ran. The return journey was a blur of exhaustion. The rain finally stopped as they reached the foothills, leaving the air scrubbed clean and bitterly cold. The clouds broke apart, revealing a moon that shone with indifferent brilliance. They walked in silence for a long time. Eli was limping, holding Abby's hand so tight his fingers turned white. Hawk trailed behind them, limping worse than the boy, but keeping a steady watch on their back trail. When they finally paused to rest near a cluster of boulders, Eli looked back at the shadow standing guard. "Is that him?" Eli whispered to Abby. "The one from the stories." "He is the one who saved you," Abby said, wiping mud from Eli's face with her sleeve. Eli stared at Hawk. The warrior was leaning against a rock, his breathing heavy. He held a bow in his hand, a short, recurve bow made of wood and sinew. "You have a bow," Eli said, his voice small. Hawk looked at the boy. His expression softened slightly. "Yes." "Did you shoot them?" Eli asked. "No arrows tonight," Hawk said. "Fear is a better weapon, and silence." "Can I see it?" Eli took a step forward, his fear momentarily forgotten in the face of boyhood curiosity. Abby started to pull him back, but Hawk lowered the bow so the boy could look. "Wood from the ash tree," Hawk explained, his English broken but clear. "Sinew from the deer. It lives." "Does it live?" Eli asked. "It bends," Hawk said. "Stone breaks, wood bends. To survive, you must bend." Eli reached out and touched the wood. He looked up at Hawk with awe. "The men said you were a monster. They said you eat children." Hawk let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh. "I eat deer, sometimes rabbits. Children are too noisy." Abby saw a smile tug at the corner of Eli's mouth. It was the first time she had seen him smile in weeks. The tension in her chest loosened just a fraction. This man, this savage, had done in one night what the entire town of Granite Peak had failed to do in 3 years. He had treated her brother like a human being. "Come," Abby said, her voice gentle. "Mama is waiting." The cabin was dark when they arrived, but the moment Abby opened the door, a lamp flared to life. Ruth stood in the center of the room, her hands shaking. She held an old, rusted shotgun that had belonged to her husband. The barrel wavered in the air. "Abby," she cried out. "It is us, Mama," Abby said quickly. Pushing Eli into the room, Ruth dropped the gun and fell upon the boy, weeping hysterically. She checked his face, his arms, pulling him into a crushing embrace. Oh God, I thought you were dead. I thought they took you. Abby stood in the doorway. Behind her, Hawk remained on the porch, hidden in the shadows. We are safe, Abby said, closing the door partially. She turned to Hawk. You should come inside. It is freezing. Hawk shook his head. He looked like he was barely standing. The adrenaline had completely evaporated, leaving behind the wreckage of his body. I go. Trouble follows me. He took one step away from the porch and stumbled. His legs simply gave out. He fell to one knee, catching himself with his hand on the dirt. Abby rushed to him. You cannot go. You are burning up. She put her arm around his waist, trying to haul him up. He had heavy, dense muscle and bone. Mama, help me, Abby called out. Ruth looked up from Eli, her eyes widening as she saw the dark figure in the doorway. She gasped, grabbing the shotgun again. An Apache, Abby? Get away! He saved Eli, Abby shouted, her voice cracking like a whip. Put the gun down. Mama, he saved your son. Ruth hesitated, looking from Eli to Abby to the bleeding man on the porch. Eli pulled away from his mother. It is true. Mama, Eli said. He scared the bad men away. He is hurt. Ruth lowered the gun. Her fear was palpable, a trembling vibration in the room, but she looked at her daughter's face. She saw the fierce determination there, the same look Jacob used to have. Bring him in, Ruth whispered, though she looked like she might faint. But only for tonight, just tonight. Abby and Eli helped Hawk into the cabin. They laid him on a rug near the hearth. The fire was nearly out, but the room was warmer than the outside. Hawk tried to protest, but his words slurred into a groan. The fever was spiking. Just tonight, Abby promised her mother, though as she looked at the severity of his condition, she knew it was a lie. He will not be walking tomorrow. She knelt beside him, checking the bandage. It was holding, but the skin around it was hot and angry. Hawk opened his eyes. They were glassy. He looked at Abby, and then his gaze drifted to Eli, who was watching him from the safety of his mother's skirts. Safe, Hawk murmured. Yes, Abby said, brushing a wet lock of hair from his forehead. We are safe. Morning came with a deceptive brilliance. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the wet desert in shades of gold and apricot. The storm was gone, leaving the air crisp and clean, but the peace was an illusion. 2 miles down the road, a buckboard wagon rattled toward town. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, was driving. She had been out early to check on her sister at the neighboring ranch. As she passed the Mercer cabin, she slowed her horses. She saw something that made her pull the reins tight. In the mud around the front porch, there were tracks, many tracks, but one set was distinct. It was the print of a moccasin, flat-soled, soft leather, and next to it, a dark smear on the porch railing that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Mrs. Gable squinted through the front window for just a fraction of a second. She saw a figure move, a man. He was shirtless, and his skin was dark. She gasped, snapping the reins. The horses jumped forward. By noon, the whisper would start in the general store. By evening, it would be a roar in the saloon. The Mercer girl, the trader's daughter. She is harboring a savage. The storm outside had passed, but the storm inside the town was just beginning, and this one would not be washed away by rain. The town of Granite Peak looked different by the light of day. The storm had scrubbed the sky a brilliant, hard blue, but down on the street, the mud was ankle-deep and churned into a brown slurry by wagon wheels. Abigail Mercer walked with her head high, though her stomach was tied in a knot tight enough to choke her. She carried a basket on her arm, the wicker creaking with every step. She needed flour, coffee, and ammunition, the basics of survival. She stepped into Henderson's general store. The bell above the door jingled a cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place. The conversation inside died instantly. 3 men standing near the potbelly stove turned to look at her. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, was at the counter. Her lips pursed so tightly they disappeared. Abby walked to the counter, placing her basket down. She could feel their eyes on her back, heavy and scratching like wool. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," Abby said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this tone in the mirror. Mr. Henderson, a man with a face like a dried apple, did not smile. He wiped his hands on his apron. "Miss Mercer, I need a sack of flour, 5 pounds, and a pound of coffee beans, and a box of .44 caliber cartridges." Henderson turned to the shelves behind him. He slammed the items onto the counter with unnecessary force. The flour puffed a small, white cloud into the air. "That'll be $3.50, Henderson said. Abby froze. $3, mister. Henderson, flour was 50 cents last week. Coffee was 40. Prices went up, Henderson said flatly, not meeting her eyes. "Road agents hitting the supply wagons. Risk premium. Or maybe," a voice came from the stove, "it is a tax on traders." Abby turned slowly. It was one of the Miller brothers, the older one, with a scar running through his eyebrow. He was leaning back in a chair, whittling a stick with a long knife. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Abby said. "Don't you—" Miller stood up. He was big, smelling of stale beer and wet horse. "Mrs. Gable saw the tracks. Abby saw the blood on your porch. You are feeding a stray dog out there. A red dog." The room seemed to shrink. The air grew hot and stifling. "My business is my own," Abby said, turning back to the counter. She dug into her purse. She counted out the coins. She had exactly $3.60. It was nearly everything they had. She placed the money on the wood. "I will take the goods." "We don't want your money," Miller said, stepping closer. "We want the town safe. You are putting everyone at risk, harboring a savage. Someone ought to go out there and burn that shack down. Take the boy away before he turns into a savage himself." Abby's hand closed around the box of cartridges. She looked Miller in the eye. "You touch my brother, and you will find out just how much of my father is in me." She grabbed her basket and walked out. She did not run, though every instinct in her body screamed at her to flee. She walked until she was past the livery stable, past the church with its judgmental steeple, and only when she reached the edge of the open desert did she stop to breathe. She leaned against a fence post, shaking. They knew, and they were not just angry. They were emboldened. The ride back to the cabin was long and tense. Abby kept her hand near the shotgun on the seat of the buckboard. Every shadow looked like a gunman. Every rustle of the sagebrush sounded like an ambush. When she arrived, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Ruth was sitting in the corner, clutching her Bible. Eli was sharpening a stick by the fire, his face grim. And Hawk was there. He was standing by the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. He had cleaned himself up as best he could. He wore a shirt that had belonged to Abby's father. It was too tight across the shoulders, straining against the muscle. But it made him look less like the wild warrior of the night before and more like a man. "The town was bad," Abby said, placing the basket on the table. "I heard," Hawk said without turning. His hearing was supernatural. He had likely heard the wagon coming for a mile. "They are talking," Abby said, pouring water from the pitcher. "They know you are here, or they suspect." "I leave tonight," Hawk said. "No," Eli said, dropping his stick. "You can't. You are still hurt." "I heal on the move," Hawk replied. He turned to face them. His movement was stiff, favoring his left side, but the fever had broken. His eyes were clear, dark and unreadable. "I stay. I bring fire to this house." Before Abby could argue, the sound of hoofbeats thundered in the yard. Not one horse, many. Hawk moved instantly. He did not run. He evaporated. He slipped into the back room where the firewood was stacked, blending into the shadows so completely that if Abby had not seen him go, she would have sworn he was never there. The door burst open without a knock. 2 men filled the frame. The first was Indian Agent Pritchard. He was a soft man, dressed in a suit that cost more than the Mercer cabin and everything in it. He had a face that looked like it had been molded from dough, pale and sweating. The second man was Captain Harlan of the cavalry. He was older, with a gray mustache and eyes that looked tired. He removed his hat, a gesture of politeness that felt jarring given the intrusion. "Miss Mercer," Pritchard said, stepping inside and looking around with a sneer of distaste. "Mrs. Mercer." "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Mr. Pritchard?" Abby asked, stepping between the men and her mother. "A welfare check," Pritchard said, smoothing his lapels. "We have received disturbing reports. Reports that this household has become morally compromised, unsafe for a child." He looked at Eli. Eli glared back with a hatred that burned. "My brother is fine," Abby said coldly. "Is he?" Pritchard walked to the table, picking up the box of cartridges Abby had just bought. He weighed it in his hand. "Living in a shack on the edge of the Badlands with a mother who is unwell and rumors of hostiles frequenting the property." "There are no hostiles here," Abby lied. Her voice did not waver. Captain Harlan spoke up, his voice gravelly. "Miss Mercer, if there is an Apache here, you must surrender him. He is a fugitive. He is dangerous." "The only dangerous people I have seen are the men who tried to kidnap my brother 2 nights ago," Abby said, looking Harlan in the eye. "Where were your soldiers then, Captain?" Harlan looked uncomfortable. He shifted his weight. "We are stretched thin, Miss," Pritchard chuckled. It was a wet, unpleasant sound. "See this hostility? It is not a good environment. I have the authority. Miss Mercer, under the Territorial Protection Act, if I deem a home unfit, I can remove the minor for his own safety. The orphanage in Tucson is very disciplined." Ruth let out a whimper. Abby felt the blood drain from her face. This was the threat she had feared most. Not death, separation. "You would not dare," Abby whispered. "Try me," Pritchard hissed. He leaned in, and for a second, the mask of the bureaucrat slipped, revealing the greed underneath. "Get rid of the trash, Abby, or lose the boy. I will give you 24 hours to prove this house is secure. If I hear one more whisper of an Apache, I'm coming back with a wagon for the kid." He turned and marched out. Harlan lingered for a second. He looked at Abby, then at Eli. He seemed about to say something, but shook his head and followed Pritchard. The door closed. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. Hawk emerged from the shadows. His face was a mask of fury. "I kill him," he said. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. "No," Abby said. She was shaking. "If you kill him, the whole cavalry will come down on us. They will hang you, and they will take Eli." "I leave," Hawk said again. He grabbed his knife from the table. "I'm going now. They find nothing. You are safe." "Safe," Abby laughed, a brittle, hysterical sound. "Did you not hear him? He doesn't care if you're here or not. He wants Eli. He wants to break us. If you leave, they win. They will come back tomorrow and find some other excuse. A broken window, a dirty floor. It doesn't matter." She paced the room, her hands in her hair. "Why? Why is he doing this? Pritchard manages the reservation supplies. Why does he care about a patch of dirt and a half-starved family?" She stopped. Her eyes fell on the window, looking out at the retreating dust of the riders. "The flower?" she whispered. "What?" Eli asked. "The flower," Abby said, her mind racing, connecting dots that had been scattered until now. In the store, Henderson said prices were up because of the raids. But when Pritchard came in, "Did you see his boots?" "Shiny," Eli said. "Muddy," Abby corrected. "Red clay mud, the kind you only find in the box canyon on the North Ridge. And his horse, the saddlebag." She grabbed Hawk's arm. "The saddlebag on Pritchard's horse. It had a brand on it, a double circle." Hawk stiffened. The men who took the boy, their horses had that brand. "Pritchard is not just the agent," Abby realized, the horror of it dawning on her. "He is the one robbing the stages. He steals the supplies meant for the reservation, sells them to the miners at a markup, and blames it on the Apaches to cover his tracks. That is why he wants you dead. You are the only one who knows the Apaches are not the ones doing it. And he wants Eli," Hawk added, "because the boy saw the men's faces." "We are loose ends," Abby said. She looked at Hawk. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. "We cannot run. If we run, he hunts us down. If we stay, he will come back tomorrow." "So we fight," Hawk said. We need proof, Abby said. Captain Harlan, he is a soldier, not a thief. I saw it in his eyes. He doesn't know. If we can prove Pritchard is behind the raids, Harlan will stop him. The ledger, Hawk said. The white men always write things down. Thieves are proud of their gold. They will be at the canyon, Abby said. Counting the take from the stagecoach they hit yesterday. We go there. We got the book. We bring it to Harlan. It was a suicide mission. 2 people, 1 wounded. 1 a seamstress against a gang of outlaws. I go, Hawk said. You stay. No, Abby said. She walked to the wall and took down the Winchester rifle that hung over the mantel. She checked the lever action. It was smooth. I know the canyon better than you. I gathered herbs there for years. I know the goat paths. You need me. Hawk looked at her. He looked at the way she held the rifle. She was not a soldier, but she was a survivor. We ride, he said. The Box Canyon was a jagged scar in the earth. 5 miles north. They left the horses a mile back and proceeded on foot. The sun was setting, casting the world in blood-red light. They moved silently. Hawk taught her where to step to avoid crunching gravel. They moved like ghosts through the sagebrush. They reached the rim of the canyon and looked down. Below, in a natural amphitheater of stone, was the camp. There were 6 men. Stark was there, and the other man from the night before. They were unloading crates from a wagon. Abby raised a small pair of opera glasses, a relic from her mother's former life, to her eyes. Look, she whispered, handing the glasses to Hawk. Hawk looked. The crates were stamped with a black eagle. Property of U.S. Indian Agency. They steal from my people, Hawk said, his voice a low rumble of rage. My people starve, and they sell our food for whiskey. There, Abby pointed. On the table, the book. A large leather-bound ledger sat on a folding table near the fire. Stark was writing in it, counting stacks of greenbacks. We need that book, Abby said. I go down, Hawk said. I draw fire. You run in, grab a book. No, Abby said. That is a good way to get killed. We create a distraction. A big one. She pointed to the far end of the canyon, where the remuda of horses was corralled. We stampede the horses. They run through the camp. In the confusion, we take the book. It was a desperate plan, but it was all they had. They split up. Hawk circled to the horse pen. Abby crept down the rocky slope toward the table, keeping behind the scrub oak. She waited. Her heart beat against the ground like a drum. Please, Hawk, be careful. Minutes ticked by. Then, a whistle pierced the air sharp and mimicking a hawk's cry. Then chaos. Hawk dropped into the corral, waving a blanket and shouting, the horses already spooked by the smell of predator and blood. Panicked, they smashed through the makeshift fence and thundered into the camp. Stampede, Stark yelled, diving out of the way of a galloping roan. The camp turned into a swirl of dust and screaming men. Gunshots rang out as they tried to turn the horses. Abby moved. She broke cover and sprinted for the table. She didn't look at the men. She looked only at the book. She reached the table. Her hand closed around the cool leather of the ledger. She grabbed a handful of papers that looked like shipping manifests too, stuffing them into her shirt. Hey! A man emerged from the dust right in front of her. It was the Miller brother. He stared at her, stunned. Abby! Abby didn't hesitate. She swung the stock of the Winchester and hit him square in the jaw. He crumpled. Hawk! She screamed. I have it! She turned to run back up the slope. Get her! Stark shouted. Shoot her! Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet. Ping! Ping! The sound of lead hitting rock was terrifying. Then, a dark shape slammed into the shooter. Hawk leaped from a boulder, tackling the man. They rolled in the dirt. Hawk's knife flashed. The man screamed. Hawk scrambled up, grabbing Abby's arm. Run up the trail! They scrambled up the goat path. Bullets whined past them like angry hornets. One struck the rock inches from Abby's face, sending stone splinters into her cheek. Hawk grunted. He stumbled, his leg buckling. A fresh stain of blood bloomed on his thigh, a new wound. Hawk! Move! He roared. shoving her upward. They crested the ridge and didn't stop. They ran through the darkening desert, the shouts of the men fading behind them. But they didn't stop. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like water. The sky opened up again. Rain. Cold, merciful rain. It washed away their tracks. They found shelter in a small cave, miles away from the canyon. It was barely a crack in the rock, but it was deep enough to hide them. They collapsed onto the sandy floor, gasping for air. It was pitch black outside. The rain formed a curtain across the cave entrance. Inside, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Abby fumbled to light a small lantern she had brought. The flame sputtered and caught, casting a warm, golden glow on the stone walls. She looked at Hawk. He was slumped against the wall, head thrown back. He was covered in mud and blood. The new wound on his thigh was bleeding, but it was a flesh wound. The old wound on his hip, however, had torn open again. Abby crawled over to him. "Let me see." Hawk looked down at her. His eyes were bright with pain, but also with something else. Adrenaline. Life. "We did it," he rasped. A smile, a real, wild smile, broke across his face. "We stole the thief's book." Abby started to laugh. It was a release of tension, bordering on tears. She pulled the ledger from her shirt and tossed it on the ground. "We did it!" She reached for the buttons of his shirt. "I need to clean this again." Hawk did not push her away. He watched her face as she worked. She unbuttoned the shirt, peeling the wet fabric away from his chest. His skin was bronze and scarred, a map of a hard life. She used the remaining water in her canteen to wash the blood away. Her hands were gentle. She touched the bruised skin around his ribs. She touched the scar on his shoulder. The atmosphere in the cave shifted. The danger was outside. Inside, there was only the heat of two bodies and the smell of rain. Abby looked up. Hawk was watching her. His gaze was intense, stripping away her defenses. "Why did you come back for me?" he asked quietly. "In the canyon. You could have run." "I do not leave my family behind," Abby whispered. The word hung in the air. Family. Hawk reached out. His hand cupped her face. His thumb brushed over the small cut on her cheek where the rock splinter had hit her. "You are brave," he said. "Braver than any man I know." Abby leaned into his touch. Her heart was beating slow and heavy now. She felt a pull, a magnetic force that she had been fighting since the moment she walked into his tent. "I am not brave," she said, her voice trembling. "I am terrified." "Fear is not weakness," Hawk murmured. He leaned closer. "Fear tells you what matters." Abby looked at his lips. She thought of the town. She thought of the whispers. Traitor, savage. She didn't care. In this cave, in this light, there was no town. There was only this man who had bled for her brother. She made the choice. She closed the distance. She kissed him. It was not a movie kiss. It was short, hesitant, tasting of salt and rain. Her lips brushed against his. A question. Hawk froze for a second, as if he couldn't believe it was happening. Then he answered. He made a low sound in his throat and his hand slid into her hair, holding her steady. He kissed her back. It was desperate and real. It was the collision of two lonely worlds. Abby's hands moved to his shoulders, pulling him closer. The pain, the cold, the fear, it all dissolved into the heat of his skin. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was ragged. He looked into her eyes, asking without words. "Are you sure?" Abby nodded. "I am sure." She kissed him again, deeper this time. Hawk groaned, pulling her into his lap, mindful of his wounds but unable to let her go. They wrapped their arms around each other, seeking comfort, seeking warmth. The lantern flickered low. The shadows lengthened, wrapping them in a cocoon of darkness. Abby buried her face in the crook of his neck, breathing him in. She felt his heart beating against her chest, strong and steady. For the first time in her life, she did not feel alone. Outside, the rain fell. Inside, the world was quiet. Abby woke before dawn. The fire had burned out. She was lying curled against Hawk's side, his arm draped protectively over her. He was still asleep, his breathing deep and even. She lay there for a moment, watching the gray light filter into the cave. She felt different, changed. She looked at the ledger lying in the dust. The proof. They had the weapon they needed. But a weapon was useless if you didn't have the courage to pull the trigger. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake him. She buttoned her dress. She smoothed her hair. She was Abigail Mercer, the trader's daughter, the woman who loved an Apache. Let the town talk, let them scream. She was done hiding. She reached out and touched Hawk's hand. He woke instantly, his eyes snapping open. "It is time," Abby said softly. Hawk sat up, wincing slightly as his wounds stretched. He looked at her, and the memory of the night before passed between them, a silent vow. "To the town," he asked. "To the town," Abby said. "We are going to finish this." She picked up the ledger. It felt heavy in her hands. It was the weight of truth, and she was ready to drop it right on Agent Pritchard's head. The community hall of Granite Peak was a structure built on hope and pretension. It was a large, barn-like building with whitewashed siding that was already beginning to peel under the relentless Arizona sun. But tonight, by the soft glow of 50 kerosene lamps, it looked almost respectable. It was 8 o'clock in the evening on a Saturday. The town had gathered for the spring social, an event that marked the end of the rainy season and the beginning of the cattle drives. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of lavender water, bay rum, roasted pork, and the underlying, sharp scent of sawdust. A fiddle player and a man with a battered accordion were sawing through a lively reel. Couples swirled across the floor, women in calico and gingham, men in their Sunday best, their boots polished to a dull shine. It was a picture of civilization in the wilderness, a desperate assertion that law, order, and decency prevailed here. But beneath the music and the laughter, a current of tension ran through the room like a submerged wire. Conversations were hushed and urgent. Eyes darted toward the door. The rumors had been festering for 2 days, fed by the sight of soldiers patrolling the streets and the grim pronouncements of Agent Pritchard, the Apache terror, the Mercer betrayal. Agent Pritchard stood near the punch bowl, holding court. He wore a suit of gray wool that was far too heavy for the climate, but it signaled his authority. He held a crystal cup in his hand, his face flushed with the heat of the room and the intoxication of power. "It is a matter of public safety," Pritchard was saying to the mayor, a round man who nodded nervously. "We cannot allow sympathy to cloud our judgment. Cancer must be cut out before it spreads. Tonight, we settle the matter of the Mercer boy." Standing slightly apart from them was Captain Harlan. The cavalry officer looked tired. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes were bloodshot. He swirled the liquid in his cup. Not drinking. He had read the reports. He had seen the fear in the town. But something in his gut, a soldier's instinct honed by 20 years on the frontier, told him that the enemy was not where everyone pointed. "Is it necessary to do this here, Agent Pritchard?" Harlan asked, his voice low. "At a dance. It is the perfect place, Captain." Pritchard smiled, his teeth small and yellow. "The community is gathered. Justice must be seen to be done. It reassures the flock." He checked his pocket watch. "The widow Mercer should be here soon. I sent 2 of my men to escort her. Once she signs the papers, the boy goes to Tucson. And if that savage shows his face..." He patted the bulge of the Derringer pistol inside his coat. The music swelled to a crescendo and then stopped. There was a ripple of polite applause. Then, the double doors at the far end of the hall swung open. The applause died. The chatter ceased. The silence that fell over the room was sudden and absolute, as if the air had been sucked out of the building. Abigail Mercer stood in the doorway. She was not wearing her usual stained work dress or the men's boots she wore to the garden. She wore a dress of deep blue silk, a relic from her mother's trunk, refashioned and taken in to fit her slender frame. It was old-fashioned, the style of a decade ago. But on her, It looked like armor. Her hair was swept up, revealing the long, elegant line of her neck. She held her head high, her face pale but composed, her eyes sweeping the room with a cold, terrifying clarity. She was beautiful. For the first time, the town saw her not as the trader's daughter, but as a woman of striking, formidable power. But it was not Abby who drew the collective gasp from the crowd. It was the man standing beside her. Hawk. He had bathed and cut his hair back. He wore a clean white shirt, buttoned to the neck, and a pair of dark trousers that Abby had mended. He did not look like the caricature in the Penny Dreadfuls. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a king in exile. He stood slightly behind her, his dark eyes scanning the room, marking every exit, every weapon, every threat. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left side, but his presence was undiminished. They stepped into the hall. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a wide aisle down the center of the room leading straight to where Pritchard and Harlan stood. "Good evening," Abby said. Her voice was not loud, but in the silence, it carried to the rafters. Pritchard recovered from his shock quickly. He set his cup down with a sharp clink. "You have some nerve, Miss Mercer, bringing a fugitive into this hall. A killer." "I see no killer," Abby said, walking forward. Her heels clicked rhythmically on the floorboards. "I see a man who saved my brother's life, which is more than I can say for anyone else in this room." She stopped 10 feet from Pritchard. Hawk stopped beside her. He did not speak. He simply watched Pritchard with a gaze that was heavy with judgment. The crowd began to murmur. "That is him," a woman whispered. "The Apache." "He doesn't look wild," another muttered. "He is a devil in disguise," a man growled. Pritchard stepped up onto the small dais where the band had been playing. He raised his hands for silence. "Citizens of Granite Peak," he bellowed. "Look at this arrogance. This woman brings a wolf into our sheepfold and calls it a pet. She endangers your children. She mocks your laws." He pointed a shaking finger at Hawk. "That man is wanted for the robbery of the Wells Fargo stage 3 days ago. He is wanted for the murder of the driver, and she stands there, hand in hand with him." "Liar," Abby said. The word cracked like a whip. Pritchard's face turned a mottled purple. "What did you say?" "I said you are a liar, Mr. Pritchard," Abby said. She reached into the folds of her skirt. "Hawk did not rob that stage, and he did not kill the driver. And I suppose we should take the word of a traitor," Pritchard sneered. He looked at the crowd, playing to their fear. "Are we going to let them insult us? Are we going to let them threaten our families?" "No," someone shouted from the back. It was one of the Miller boys. "Arrest him," another voice cried. Captain Harlan stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his saber. "Miss Mercer," he said, his voice stern but not unkind. "If you have evidence, present it. Otherwise, I have no choice but to take this man into custody." "I have evidence," Abby said. Before she could produce the ledger, a window at the side of the hall shattered. The sound of breaking glass was followed instantly by the roar of an explosion outside. The ground shook. Orange light flared against the windows, bright and terrifying. "Fire!" a man screamed from the doorway. "The stables are on fire!" "It is an attack!" Pritchard screamed, seizing the moment. "Apache raid! They are attacking the town! Get the women down!" Chaos erupted. It was a masterpiece of orchestration. Stark and his men, paid by Pritchard, had ignited the hay barn behind the hall and fired their Winchesters into the air. The crowd panicked. Men shouted. Women screamed. And the stampede for the doors began. But the doors were jammed with bodies. "They are killing us!" Pritchard yelled, drawing his pistol. "Kill the savage! He signaled them!" He leveled his gun at Hawk. Hawk moved. He did not attack Pritchard. He saw something the panicked mob did not. A decorative bunting hanging from the rafters had caught a spark from a tipped kerosene lamp during the initial surge. The fabric, dry as kindling, went up in a sheet of flame. It burned through the support rope of a heavy iron chandelier directly above the center of the floor. Directly underneath it, paralyzed by fear, stood the mayor's 7-year-old daughter, clutching her doll. "Move," Hawk roared. He dove. He launched himself across the gap, tackling the little girl just as the iron fixture crashed down. It smashed into the floorboards with the force of a hammer, sending sparks and glass shrapnel flying. Hawk shielded the child with his own body. He took the impact of the debris on his back. A heavy shard of glass sliced across his shoulder, but he did not let go of the girl. The crash stunned the room into a momentary freeze. Hawk rolled over, wincing, and lifted the girl. She was crying but unharmed. He stood up, the child in his arms, and walked over to the mayor's wife, who was screaming at the edge of the circle. He handed the child to her mother. "She is safe," Hawk said. His voice was calm, cutting through the hysteria. The mayor's wife stared at him. She stared at the Apache who had just risked his life to save her daughter while the civilized men were trampling each other to get out. The fire in the rafters sputtered out. Having consumed the bunting, the fire outside was crackling, but the raid seemed to have paused. Abby seized the silence. She climbed onto a chair, her blue dress standing out against the smoke. "There is no raid," she shouted. "There are no Apaches outside." She pulled the heavy leather ledger from under her shawl and threw it onto the floor. It landed with a heavy thud at Captain Harlan's feet. "Open it, Captain," Abby commanded. "Read the last entry." Pritchard's eyes widened. He recognized the book. "Do not listen to her. It is a trick." "Shoot him!" Pritchard raised his gun again, aiming at Hawk's back. "Drop it!" The command came from Captain Harlan. He had picked up the ledger and flipped it open. His face was pale with fury. "I said drop it! Pritchard!" Harlan drew his service revolver and leveled it at the agent. Pritchard froze. "Captain, are you mad I am a government official?" "This ledger," Harlan said, his voice shaking with rage, "details the sale of 200 rifles and 5,000 rounds of ammunition to a mining syndicate in Mexico. Dated yesterday. Signed by you." Harlan looked up, addressing the room. "And it lists payments to a man named Stark for security services specifically for the disruption of the stage line to create a pretext for military intervention." The crowd murmured, confused but listening. "You," Harlan pointed his gun at Pritchard. "You have been robbing the stages. You have been stealing the reservation supplies. And you have been blaming it on the Apaches to get the army to wipe them out so you could sell the land rights." "That is a lie," Pritchard screamed. "It is a forgery." "And the men outside," Abby called out. "The ones shooting in the air, they are Stark's men. Look at their horses. They bear the Double Circle brand, the same brand listed in that book as the property of your shell company." The truth hit the room like a physical blow. The people of Granite Peak looked from the calm, bleeding Apache warrior to the sweating, frantic Indian agent. Pritchard realized the game was up. The mask fell away, revealing the rat underneath. "You fools!" Pritchard spat. "I was bringing you progress. I was clearing the way for civilization." He spun around, grabbing the mayor's wife, the woman holding the child Hawk had just saved. He jammed his pistol against her head. "Back off!" Pritchard shrieked. "Back off or I paint the wall with her!" The crowd gasped and surged back. Harlan held his fire, unable to shoot without hitting the woman. "Get the horses!" Pritchard yelled to his accomplices, who were now peering through the broken windows. Realizing the tide had turned, "Stark, get in here!" 3 men kicked open the side door, rifles raised. It was Stark and the Miller brothers. "Nobody moves," Stark yelled. The standoff was absolute. Pritchard edged toward the door, dragging the sobbing woman with him. "I'm leaving," Pritchard hissed. "And I'm taking the ledger. Kick it over here. Harlan." Harlan hesitated. Hawk moved again. He did not have a gun. He did not have a knife, but he had the element that Pritchard had forgotten: the people. Hawk looked at the blacksmith, a giant of a man named Thomas, whose daughter was the one Hawk had saved. He looked at the baker, whose son Abby had treated for a fever last winter. "He threatens your women," Hawk said. His voice was low, but it carried, "He burns your town." "Is he your chief?" Thomas the blacksmith looked at Pritchard. He looked at the gun pressed to the neighbor's head. He looked at the Apache who had saved his child. Thomas picked up a heavy iron chair. "No," Thomas growled. Thomas hurled the chair. It didn't hit Pritchard, but it smashed into Stark, knocking the rifle from his hands. That was the spark. The town of Granite Peak, tired of fear, tired of being manipulated, exploded. But this time, their anger was directed at the true enemy. Men tackled the Miller brothers. The mayor, emboldened, grabbed a bottle and smashed it over the head of the man guarding the door. In the confusion, Pritchard fired. The shot went wild. Hitting the ceiling, Hawk lunged. He covered the distance in 2 strides. He didn't strike Pritchard. He simply grabbed the agent's wrist and twisted. There was a sickening snap of bone. Pritchard screamed and dropped the gun. The mayor's wife scrambled free. Hawk swept Pritchard's legs out from under him, slamming him to the floor. He placed his knee on Pritchard's chest and picked up the fallen pistol. For a second, the room held its breath. The savage with the gun. The white man on the floor. Hawk looked at the gun. Then he looked at Captain Harlan. With a deliberate movement, Hawk reversed the pistol and handed it, handle first, to the captain. "Your law," Hawk said. Harlan took the gun. He looked at Hawk with a mixture of shame and profound respect. "My law," Harlan agreed. He hauled Pritchard up by his collar. "Agent Pritchard, you are under arrest for treason, grand larceny, and attempted murder." Soldiers poured into the hall, real soldiers, brought by the sound of gunfire. They disarmed Stark and the Millers. The threat was over. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of shame. The townspeople looked at Abby. They looked at her dress, standing out like a bruise in the room. They looked at Hawk, bleeding from his shoulder, standing tall and silent. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, stepped forward, wringing his hat. "Miss Mercer, Abby, we didn't know." "You didn't look," Abby said. Her voice was shaking, not with fear, but with the release of 1,000 suppressed tears. "We were scared." "Mrs.," Gable said. "They told us." "They told you to hate," Abby said. She walked to the center of the room, standing next to Hawk. She took his hand. This time, nobody flinched. "You let them tell you who to hate because it was easier than asking the truth," Abby said. She looked at the faces of the people she had grown up with. "You called my father a thief. You called my brother a mistake. You called me a traitor." She paused, looking at Captain Harlan, then back to the crowd. "I do not want your apologies," Abby said, her voice rising, clear and bell-like. "I do not need you to like me. I do not need you to invite me to your dances or buy my herbs." She squeezed Hawk's hand, feeling the calluses, the warmth, the life. "I need you to leave my family alone," she said. "I need you to understand that this man, this savage, has more honor in his spilled blood than that man." She pointed to Pritchard. "Has, in his entire bank account." She looked at Eli, who had slipped in during the commotion and was standing by the door, wide-eyed. "We are going home," Abby said. She turned her back on the town of Granite Peak. Hawk walked with her. He did not look back. He did not gloat. He walked with the quiet dignity of a man who knows who he is, and who knows he has been found by the one person who matters. The crowd parted for them again, but this time, as they walked out into the cool night air, someone began to clap. It was Thomas the blacksmith. One slow clap, then another, then the mayor's wife joined in, then Captain Harlan. The applause followed them out into the dark, a belated, awkward offering of respect. Outside, the fire in the barn had been extinguished by the rain that had started to fall again, a gentle, cleansing shower. Abby stopped on the steps of the hall. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the smell of wet earth. "It is over," she whispered. Hawk looked at her. He reached out and wiped a smudge of soot from her cheek. "No," he said softly. "The war is over. Life, it begins." He looked toward the horizon, where the moon was breaking through the clouds. "You fought well. Firehair," he said. Abby smiled, a tired, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You weren't so bad yourself. Apache? They walked toward the wagon where Ruth was waiting, weeping softly but safe. The nightmare of the last 3 years was broken. The town would never be perfect. Prejudice would not vanish overnight. But the silence was broken. The truth was out. And Abigail Mercer had found something worth more than acceptance. She had found a partner. The wagon carrying Agent Pritchard rolled out of Granite Peak at 9 o'clock in the morning. It was a prisoner transport from the territorial marshals, a heavy, iron-barred cage on wheels that rattled violently over the ruts of the main street. Captain Harlan rode alongside it, his back stiff, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He did not look at the man inside the man who had once dined at his table and spoken of civilization while selling it out the back door. Pritchard sat slumped on the bench, his fine suit ruined, his arm in a sling where Hawk had snapped the bone. He looked smaller now, deflated by the sudden absence of his power, staring out at the town he had manipulated with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. Abby stood on the boardwalk outside the Mercantile, watching them go. The town watched with her. It was a strange morning. The air felt lighter, scrubbed clean by the storm and the revelation in the community hall. But the ground was still muddy. The social fabric of Granite Peak had not been repaired overnight. It had merely been broken open. And now everyone was staring at the jagged edges. There were no cheers as the wagon passed. There was only a heavy, thoughtful silence. Some people, like Mrs. Gable, looked at the ground, unable to see Abby's eyes. The shame was there, thick and suffocating. They had been the mob. They had been the weapon Pritchard used. To look at Abby now was to see their own weakness reflected in her steady gaze. But others still stared with hard, flinty eyes. The Miller brothers were in chains in a second wagon, cursing and spitting. Their cousins on the sidewalk watched with hands hovering near their belts. For them, the truth did not matter as much as the humiliation. A white man had been taken down by an Apache. That was a wound that would fester. Truth be damned. "It is done," a voice said beside her. Abby turned. Ruth stood there, clutching her shawl. She looked older this morning, the lines around her eyes etched deep by years of worry. But she was not shaking. For the first time in 3 years, Ruth Mercer was standing on the main street without looking like she wanted to disappear into the cracks of the boardwalk. "The head is cut off," Abby said quietly. "But the snake still writhes." "Let it writhe," Ruth said, her voice surprisingly firm. "As long as it is not in my house." The change was subtle, but it was there. When they had walked into Henderson's store 10 minutes earlier, the bell had jingled, and the conversation had stopped just like always. But this time, Mr. Henderson had not slammed the flour on the counter. He had weighed it carefully. He had looked at the ledger, the honest one, and cleared his throat. I might have overcharged you on the coffee last week, Mrs. Mercer," Henderson had mumbled, not looking up. "Calculation error. I put the credit on your account." It was not an apology. Men like Henderson did not apologize to women like Ruth. But it was a concession. It was an admission that the ground had shifted, and he needed to find his footing again. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," Ruth had said, taking her goods. She did not smile, but she did not hurry. She paid with the coin she had, and she walked out with her head up. Now, as the prisoner wagons disappeared into the dust of the road leading to the territorial court, Abby felt a hand touch her elbow. She flinched instinctively, turning ready to fight. It was a woman. Sarah Miller, the wife of the cousin of the men in chains. She was holding a small child on her hip, a boy with a hacking cough that sounded like tearing canvas. "Miss Mercer," Sarah said. Her eyes darted around, terrified of being seen speaking to the traitor. "Mrs. Miller," Abby said, keeping her voice neutral. "My boy," Sarah whispered, shifting the child. "The doctor. He says it is just a cold, but he burns at night. And he cannot breathe." Abby looked at the child. She saw the flushed cheeks, the shallow, rattling breath, pleurisy, or the beginning of pneumonia. "He needs willow bark tea," Abby said automatically, and a poultice of mustard seed and flour on his chest to break the congestion. Keep him out of the draft. Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I do not have mustard seed. Abby reached into her basket. She pulled out a small brown paper packet she had just bought. Take this, mix it with warm water, make a paste, put it on a cloth, not directly on the skin, or it will blister. Sarah took the packet. Her fingers brushed Abby's. They say you are wicked, Abby, but my husband, he is a fool who follows loud voices. I just want my boy to breathe. Go, Abby said gently. Before he sees you. Sarah hurried away. Abby watched her go. The wall of hatred was not gone, but there was a crack in it now. A crack wide enough to pass a packet of mustard seeds through. 2 miles out of town, in the shadow of the red rocks, Hawk was conducting his own kind of restoration. He stood by the corral of Old Man McGregor, a cattleman who ran a small herd of stubborn longhorns in the scrubland. McGregor was leaning on the fence, chewing on a piece of straw, watching the Apache warrior empty a burlap sack onto the ground. Out fell a saddle, a silver bridle, and a box of carpentry tools. Found them in the canyon, Hawk said. His English was improving, though he still treated words like expensive ammunition only to be used when necessary. Stark's men took them, hide them in the rocks. McGregor looked at the pile. He looked at the saddle, which had his initials burned into the leather. It had been stolen 2 months ago. Everyone had said it was the Apaches. You walked 6 miles to bring this back, McGregor asked, squinting against the sun. It is not mine, Hawk said. Could have sold it, McGregor noted. That silver bit is worth $5 in Tucson. I am not a thief, Hawk said. He held the old man's gaze. And I am not what they say. It was a simple statement, stripped of pride or plea. It was just a fact, like the heat of the sun or the hardness of the rock. McGregor chewed his straw. He was a man of the Old West, a man who judged a horse by its teeth and a man by his hands. He looked at Hawk's hands scarred, capable, and currently open. I am short a hand for the branding season, McGregor said casually. My knees aren't what they used to be. Pay is $20 a month and found... Hawk paused. He looked at the horizon, toward the mountains where his people moved like ghosts. Then he looked back at the rancher. I do not live in a bunkhouse, Hawk said. Didn't ask you to. McGregor shrugged. You live where you want. Just show up at sunrise. And don't eat the calves. A ghost of a smile touched Hawk's lips. I prefer deer. Sunrise, then, McGregor said, turning back to his herd. It was not accepted into the fold. Hawk would never be invited to Sunday dinner, but it was respect. It was a transaction between men, uncolored by the lies of the last 3 years. As Hawk turned to leave, he saw a figure standing on the ridge above the ranch. He stopped. The figure raised a hand. It was Grey Wolf, an elder from a band that camped near the Verde River. Hawk climbed the slope, his movements silent. Grey Wolf looked at him with eyes that were black and unreadable. He looked at the white man's shirt Hawk wore, the cut of his hair. You walk between the lines. Little Hawk, Grey Wolf said in their own tongue. It is a dangerous place. The wind blows from both sides. The lines are drawn by men who are blind, Hawk replied. I walk where I choose. They say you fight for the White Eyes now, Grey Wolf said. They say you saved their children and captured their enemies. Some of the young men call you a fool. They say the White Eyes will use you and then hang you. They might, Hawk admitted. But I did not fight for them. I fought for myself. And for her. Grey Wolf looked down toward the Mercer cabin, a tiny speck in the distance. The healer woman. She has fire. She has honor, Hawk said. More than many who carry spears. You cannot be both. Hawk, Grey Wolf warned. One day, the circle will close. You will have to choose. I have chosen, Hawk said. I choose freedom, and freedom means I am not bound by your hate for them, nor their hate for me. Grey Wolf was silent for a long time. Then he nodded, a slow, solemn movement. Go then, but watch your back. The coyote bites the hand that feeds it, and the white man shoots the hand that helps him. I know, Hawk said. He watched the elder slip away into the rocks, disappearing as if he had never been there. Hawk felt the pull of his old life, the simplicity of the hunt and the fire. But then he thought of Abby standing in the community hall, throwing the ledger down like a gauntlet. He turned and walked down the slope, toward the cabin. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was new and fragile. The threat of Pritchard was gone, and the immediate violence had subsided. But the reality of their lives remained hard. They were still poor. They were still outcasts, even if they were now respected outcasts. Abby and Hawk sat on the porch steps one evening, a week after the arrest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet. The air was cooling rapidly. Abby was mending a harness. Hawk was whittling a piece of ironwood. Winter is coming, Hawk said. He didn't look up from his knife. I know, Abby said. We have enough flour for 2 months. If the potatoes are held in the cellar, we will be fine. The roof needs tar, Hawk said, and the wood pile is low. Eli can help with the wood, Abby said. And I sold 3 jars of salve today. That is another $1. They were talking about survival. It was not the poetic romance of the storybooks. It was the romance of reality. It was counting cartridges and checking for rot in the vegetables. Abby stopped sewing. She looked at him. The light caught the sharp angles of his face. He was still healing. The wound on his hip was a pink scar now, but it still stiffened when it rained. You could go, she said softly. To the mountains. The deer are fat this time of year. You wouldn't have to worry about tarring roofs or what the town thinks. Hawk stopped whittling. He blew the shavings off the wood. He looked at her. I could go. He agreed. It is easier in the mountains. No fences, no money. So why stay? Abby asked. It was the question that had been haunting her. Why would a wild creature choose a cage? Even if the door was open, Hawk reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused from the work at McGregor's ranch. Because the mountains are cold alone, he said. And because freedom is not just about where you put your feet. It is about where you put your heart. He squeezed her hand. I do not promise you it will be easy. Abby, they will stare. They will whisper. The winter will be hard. I am not afraid of hard work, Abby said. I know, Hawk said. But are you afraid of us, of what we are? Abby looked at their joined hands. Red skin and white skin. A combination that was forbidden by every unwritten law of the territory. Every day, she admitted. I'm afraid every time you ride into town that you won't come back. I'm afraid they will find a reason to take Eli. But, she looked up at him, her eyes fierce. I would rather be afraid with you than safe without you. Hawk smiled. It was a rare, genuine smile that made him look 10 years younger. Then we fixed the roof. The next morning, the sound of laughter rang out from the dry creek bed. Abby looked out the window. Eli was down there with Hawk. The boy was holding a length of rope, trying to throw a loop over a stump. He missed the rope tangling around his own ankles. Hawk did not laugh. He walked over, untangled the boy, and adjusted his grip. Not with the arm, Abby heard Hawk say. With the wrist, like snapping a whip. Eli tried again. The loop sailed out, sloppy but open, and caught the edge of the stump. I got it, Eli yelled. Did you see? Hawk, I got it. Good, Hawk said. Now do it again, 50 times, until your hand knows the rope better than your eyes. Abby wiped her hands on her apron and walked down to them. Eli was beaming. The shadows that had haunted his eyes since the kidnapping were fading, replaced by the focus of learning. He was growing stronger, his shoulders filling out. He is going to be a better cowboy than me, Hawk said as Abby approached. He just needs to learn to keep his thumb down, Abby said, critiquing the throw. Eli looked at her. Since when do you know how to rope? Abby, since before you were born. Abby smiled. Papa taught me. She looked at Hawk. Is he ready for the tracks? Tomorrow, Hawk said. We go to the ridge. I teach him to read the ground, to know who walked there, how fast, and if they were carrying a burden, Why? Eli asked. So I can hunt the men who hurt us. The question hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. Abby knelt down so she was eye level with her brother. She put her hands on his shoulders. No, Eli, she said firmly. Not to hunt them. But they hurt us, Eli said, his jaw tightening. Pritchard, the Millers. I want to be strong so I can make them pay. Abby looked at Hawk. Hawk nodded slightly. This was the precipice. The boy could fall into the cycle of vengeance, or he could rise above it. You learn to track, Hawk said to the boy, his voice low and serious. So you are never surprised. You learn to rope so you can control the beast, not kill it. You learn to fight so you do not have to. Hatred makes you blind. Eli, Abby added. If you learn these things just to hurt people, you are no better than Pritchard. You are just another man with a gun and a grudge, and the world has enough of those. Then what do I learn them for? Eli asked, confused. For freedom, Abby said. You learn them so that no matter where you go, no matter what anyone takes from you, you can survive. You can build a fire. You can find water. You can protect your home. To be free, Hawk said, is to need nothing from the enemy, not even his blood. Eli looked from his sister to the warrior. He thought about it, the rope heavy in his hand. Okay, he said quietly. For freedom. 3 weeks later, the wagon was packed. They were not leaving the territory. They were not running away. But the cabin by the road held too many ghosts. It was too exposed, too close to the stairs of the town. Abby had found a spot. It was 5 miles further east, up a winding draw where a spring bubbled out of the rock year-round. There was a grove of cottonwood trees, thick and shading. The grass was good for the horses. It was unclaimed land, rough, rocky, and hard to reach. Perfect. Ruth sat on the wagon seat, looking back at the old cabin one last time. I buried your father there, she said softly. He isn't there, Mama, Abby said, climbing up beside her. He is where the peace is, and there was no peace in that house. Hawk rode ahead on his paint horse, a new mount bought with his first month's wages. Eli rode double behind him, pointing out a hawk circling in the thermals. They moved slowly through the landscape. The red rocks towered above them, ancient and indifferent. As they reached the rise that overlooked their new home, Abby stopped the wagon. Down below, the cottonwoods turned gold in the autumn light. The creek sparkled like a vein of silver. It was wild. It was isolated. It was beautiful. It will be hard work, Ruth noted, but her voice didn't have the old tremble. We will need to clear the scrub for a garden. Hawk says the soil is good near the water, Abby said. And the neighbors? Ruth asked. Abby looked at the vast, empty horizon. The coyotes, the stars, and us. Hawk turned his horse and trotted back to the wagon. He stopped beside Abby. Home, he asked. Abby looked at the land. Then she looked at him. Yes, she said. Home. They drove the wagon down the slope, the wheels crunching over the gravel. They were moving away from the center of the world, away from the town and its laws and its judgments. They were moving to the edge. But as Abby watched the wind ripple through the grass, she realized that the edge was not where things ended. It was where the view was clearest. They had lost their standing in society. They had lost the illusion of safety, but they had kept their dignity. They had kept each other, and in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. Spring arrived in the Arizona territory, not with a whisper, but with a riot of color that seemed impossible after the gray austerity of winter. The rains that had once threatened to wash the Mercers away had instead soaked deep into the cracked earth, waking seeds that had slept for years. The desert floor, usually a tapestry of browns and dusty greens, was suddenly carpeted in gold poppies and purple verbena. The ocotillo plants, looking like bundles of dead sticks for most of the year, burst into flame at their tips, waving red flags against the azure sky. It was a violent, beautiful rebirth, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest places, life did not just endure, it insisted on thriving. 5 miles east of Granite Peak, in the shelter of the Cottonwood Grove, Abigail Mercer straightened her back and wiped a forearm across her brow. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands caked in rich, dark soil. The garden was no longer just a hope. It was a reality. Rows of beans were climbing the trellis Hawk had built from willow branches. Squash vines were spreading their broad leaves like protective umbrellas over the damp earth. And in the corner, protected by a ring of river stones, was Abby's true pride, her apothecary. Sage, mallow, arnica, and aloe grew in neat, tended clusters. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her apron. She looked toward the creek, where the water bubbled clear and cold over the rocks. The sound was a constant, soothing music that had replaced the anxious silence of their old life. A dog barked, a scruffy, mixed-breed shepherd that Eli had found wandering near the road and coaxed home with scraps of jerky. "Buster, get back here." Eli's voice rang out, high and clear. Abby smiled. She shaded her eyes and watched her brother running through the tall grass, the dog nipping at his heels. Eli had grown 2 inches over the winter. His skin was brown from the sun, his hair bleached white blonde. He no longer walked with the hunch of a boy expecting a blow. He ran with the careless abandon of a child who knows he is safe. She turned as she heard the rhythmic thud of hooves on the hard-packed trail leading up to the house. Hawk was coming home. He rode the paint horse, sitting easy in the saddle, his body moving in perfect sync with the animal. He wore a wide-brimmed hat now, pulled low against the glare, and a canvas vest over his shirt. He looked like any other ranch hand in the territory, until you saw the way he scanned the horizon, not with the boredom of a laborer, but with the alertness of a guardian. He had been working for Mr. McGregor for 6 months. The work was hard branding calves, mending fences, driving strays out of the box canyons, but the pay was fair, $20 a month, and more importantly, the respect was earned. McGregor had told the men in the bunkhouse that anyone who had a problem with the Apache could take it up with him, or with the Apache himself. After Hawk had ridden a particularly vicious Mustang to a standstill without using a whip, the grumbling in the bunkhouse had ceased. Hawk pulled the horse up to the hitching rail Hawk had built near the garden. He swung down, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was covered in the dust of the day, smelling of horse sweat and leather, but his eyes were bright. "The beans are climbing," he observed, nodding at the trellis. "They like the sun," Abby said, walking over to him. She did not shy away from the dust on his clothes. She reached out and took the canteen from his shoulder. "And the irrigation ditch you dug is holding water well." Hawk took off his hat and slapped it against his leg, sending a cloud of dust drifting away in the breeze. "McGregor says the herd is strong. The calves are heavy. It will be a good year." "A good year," Abby repeated. The words felt strange on her tongue, heavy with promise. For so long, they had only hoped for a survivable year. "Is the doctor in?" a voice called from the trail. Abby and Hawk turned. A buckboard wagon was pulling up. It was driven by a man named Elias Thorne, a prospector who worked a claim up in the Silver Rims. Sitting beside him was his wife, a Navajo woman named Nolly. "The doctor is in the garden," Abby called back, smiling. She was not a certified physician. She had no diploma from the East. But the people of the territory, those who lived on the fringes, the poor, the natives, and the drifters did not care about paper. They cared about results. And word had spread that the Mercer girl knew how to break a fever and stitch a cut so it didn't fester. Elias climbed down, helping Nolly. "It is the baby," Elias said, his face lined with worry. "She is hot to the touch, and she will not nurse." Abby wiped her hands on a rag. "Bring her to the porch. Ruth has water boiling." Abby went to work. It was not magic. It was patience and knowledge. She checked the infant's gums teething, combined with a mild heat rash. She instructed Nolly on how to make a cool compress from the aloe in the garden and gave them a tincture of chamomile to settle the child's stomach. Hawk stood by the rail, watching her. He did not interfere. This was her domain. He saw the way Elias, a white man who had likely shot at Apaches in his youth, looked at Abby with gratitude. He saw the way Nolly, a woman of the tribes, spoke to Abby as a sister. The wall that had divided their world was crumbling. It was not gone. There were still shops in Granite Peak where Abby was served last, and saloons where Hawk could not enter, but the hatred had lost its venom. The truth of the ledger and the heroism at the dance had shamed the town into a grudging truce. They had seen the truth, and while truth did not always bring love, it brought silence to the wicked. When the wagon left an hour later, the sun was beginning to dip below the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. Ruth came out onto the porch, wiping a bowl with a cloth. "Stew is ready," she said. "Venison and potatoes." "It smells good, Mama," Abby said. Ruth looked at Hawk. "You washed your hands?" "Yes, Ruth," Hawk said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Good. Set the table. Eli," Ruth called out. They ate together as the twilight settled. It was a simple meal, but to Abby, it felt like a feast. She looked around the table. Her mother, who had once been a ghost in her own life, was now humming as she served the bread. Eli was talking with his mouth full, telling Hawk about a lizard he had caught. And Hawk sat at the head of the table. He did not say much, but his presence was the anchor that held the room steady. He listened to Eli. He nodded at Ruth, and every time his eyes met Abby's, there was a quiet conversation that needed no words. After dinner, the air turned cool, carrying the scent of pine down from the high country. "Walk with me," Hawk said to Abby. It was not a question. Abby threw a shawl over her shoulders and followed him. They walked away from the cabin, down the path that led to the creek. The moon was rising, a sliver of silver that cast long, mysterious shadows through the cottonwoods. They stopped by the water. The creek was wider here, pooling into a deep, quiet basin before tumbling over the rocks. Hawk stood looking at the water for a long time. The silence between them was comfortable, worn smooth by the months of working side by side. "McGregor offered me the foreman job," Hawk said suddenly. Abby looked at him, surprised. "Foreman, that is a big responsibility, and a white man's job." "He says I know the cows better than the men," Hawk shrugged. "And the men listen when I speak, because I do not speak often. Will you take it?" "It means $30 a month," Hawk said. "And a house on his land if I want it." Abby felt a sudden, sharp pang in her chest. A house on his land. "Oh." Hawk turned to face her. He reached into the pocket of his vest. "But I told him I have a house, and I have land that needs me." He pulled his hand out. In his palm lay a small object. Abby stepped closer, squinting in the moonlight. It was a ring, but it was not gold or silver. It was made of ironwood, carved and polished until it was smooth as glass, dark and rich. Embedded in the center of the wood was a piece of turquoise, rough-cut but brilliant blue, the color of the desert sky at noon. It was held in place not by metal prongs, but by a thin strip of rawhide, wrapped and sealed with pine resin. "I have no gold to give you, Abigail Mercer," Hawk said. His voice was low, stripping away the silence of the night. "I have no silk dresses. I have no name that is written in the church books." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses on her palm marks of the work she had done to build their life. "This wood is from the tree that sheltered us in the storm," Hawk said. "This stone is from the creek where we drink. This leather is from the deer that fed us." He looked into her eyes, his gaze fierce and vulnerable. "It is made of this land. It is made by these hands. That is all I have." Abby looked at the ring. It was rough. It was simple. And it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was not a promise of ease. It was a promise of endurance. It was a piece of the earth they had fought for. She felt tears prick her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of an overwhelming, swelling joy. She thought of the silk dress she had worn to the dance, the armor she had put on to fight the town. She didn't need armor anymore. "I do not want gold," Abby whispered. Her voice was steady, gaining strength with every word. "Gold is cold, and it can be stolen." She reached out and took the ring from his palm. She slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, warm against her skin. "I want the hands that made this," she said. "I want the man who stood in the fire for my brother. I want you, Hawk." She looked up at him, and she laughed a sound of pure release. "The most right thing I ever did in my life was to trust you, to choose you." Hawk let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away the single tear that had escaped. "Then it is a good bargain," he murmured. "For I have gained a queen." He kissed her then. It was not the desperate, adrenaline-fueled kiss of the cave, nor the tentative kiss of the first night. It was a kiss of belonging. It was deep and slow, tasting of the night air and the promise of tomorrow. From back at the cabin, a sound drifted down to them. It was Eli, who had evidently escaped his bedtime again. He was running in the yard, banging a stick against an old metal pot, shouting something that sounded like a war cry mixed with a cowboy song. "My brother is waking the coyotes," Abby said, pulling back slightly, though she did not let go of Hawk's waist. "He is announcing his territory." Hawk smiled. "He has a loud spirit." "He is happy," Abby said. "We are an odd family. Hawk, a widow, a half-wild boy, a healer, and an Apache warrior. We do not fit in any box. Boxes are for dead things," Hawk said. "We are living." Later that night, after the moon had climbed high and the desert had settled into its profound silence, Abby stepped out of the cabin. She wore her nightdress, a white cotton shift that glowed in the dark. She wrapped her shawl tight against the chill. Hawk did not sleep in the cabin. The walls still made him restless. He had built a structure nearby, a traditional wickiup made of brush and canvas, but reinforced with timber. It was his space, a blend of his old life and his new one. Abby walked across the yard. The gravel was cool under her bare feet. She reached the flap of the structure. Inside, a small lantern was burning low, casting a warm, amber circle of light. Hawk was sitting on his bedroll, mending a bridle. He looked up as her shadow fell across the entrance. He went still. Abby stood there, her hand on the canvas flap. The scene was a mirror of that first night, months ago. The storm, the fear, the desperate mistake of running into the wrong tent. But tonight, there was no storm. There was no fear. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I am entering," she whispered. Hawk set the bridle down. He did not move to hide her. He did not move to grab a weapon. He simply sat there, his heart in his eyes. "You are in the wrong place, white girl," he said softly. But the words were different this time. They lacked the sharp edge of warning. They were a tease, a callback, a shared secret. Abby smiled. She stepped inside, letting the flap fall closed behind her, shutting out the rest of the world. "Am I?" she asked, moving toward him. Hawk shook his head slowly. A smile, crooked and devastatingly handsome, spread across his face. "That mistake," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That night you entered the wrong tent. It is the thing I pray to the spirits for. I pray that if I lived 1,000 lives, you would make that mistake in every one of them." Abby sank down beside him. She reached out and touched the scar on his chest, the old wound, now healed. "Then do not call it a mistake," she whispered. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. "Call it destiny. Call it the path I chose." "Destiny," Hawk agreed. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her down into the warmth of the furs and blankets. "Destiny has blue eyes and a stubborn heart," Abby added. "That too." They lay together in the quiet dark, the lantern flickering out. Outside, the wind blew through the canyons, wild and free. It rattled the leaves of the cottonwoods and whispered over the stones of the creek. In the stories of the West, freedom was often painted as a man riding alone into the sunset, beholden to no one. But as Abby closed her eyes, listening to the steady beat of Hawk's heart, she knew the truth. Freedom was not being alone. Freedom was the courage to stand still when the world told you to run. Freedom was the bravery to build a roof in the wind. Freedom was daring to love the one person the world told you to hate, and finding in that forbidden choice the only home that ever mattered. The wind could blow all it wanted. They were not going anywhere. The screen fades to black as the embers of the fire glow in the dark, and the sound of the wind blends with a soft acoustic guitar melody. Author's note, outro. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We have traveled a long, dusty road with Abby and Hawk, from the terror of the storm to the peace of the cottonwood grove. It has been a journey about courage, prejudice, and the incredible power of choosing your own family. I would love to hear your thoughts on their ending. Do you think the town will ever fully accept them? And more importantly, I'm curious, where are you listening to this story from right now? Please leave a comment below and share your location. Let's see how far this wagon train stretches across the world. If you enjoyed The Young Girl Entered the Wrong Tent, please consider subscribing to the channel Wild West Tales. Hit that like button to help us around the campfire. And if you really want to support the channel and help these stories reach more people, please smash that hype button. Your support keeps the legends of the West alive. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open. Goodbye.